Chapter 20. The Andersonian Theory. The legend or theory of Dr. Anderson is detailed first in the edition of the Book of Constitutions, which was edited by him and published in the year 1723, and was then more extensively developed in the subsequent edition of the same work published in 1738. Anderson was acquainted with the more recent legend of the craft, and very fully cites it from a manuscript or record of Freemasons written in the reign of Edward IV, that is, toward the end of the 15th century. If Anderson's quotations from this manuscript are correct, it must be one of those that has been lost and not yet recovered. For among some other events not mentioned in the manuscripts that are now extant, he states that the charges and laws of the Freemasons had been seen and perused by Henry VI and his council, and had been approved by them. He does not appear to have met with any of the earlier manuscripts, such as those of Hallowell and Roberts, which contain the legend in its older form, for he makes no use of the legend of Euclid, passing over the services of that geometrician lightly, as the later manuscripts do. Footnote. In the slight mention that he makes of Euclid, Anderson has observed the true chronology and placed him in the era of Ptolemy Lagus, 300 years BC. And not ascribing to him the origin of the order in Egypt, which theory is the peculiar characteristic of the older legend, but out of the later legend and from whatever manuscripts containing it to which he had access, Anderson has formed a legend of his own. In this he has added many things of his own creation, and given a more detailed narrative, if not a more correct one, than that contained in the legend of the craft. Anderson's legend, or theory, of the rise and progress of Masonry, as it is contained in the first edition of the Book of Constitutions, was for a long time accepted by the craft as a true history of the order, and it has exercised a very remarkable influence in the framing of other theories on this subject, which from time to time have been produced by subsequent writers. To the student, therefore, who is engaged in the investigation of the legendary history of Masonry, this Andersonian legend is of great importance. While the legend of the craft, in its pure form, was very little known to the great body of Masonic writers and students until the manuscripts containing this legend in its various forms were made common to the Masonic public by the labors of Hallowell, Cook, and above all by Huygen and his earnest collaborators in Masonic archaeology, the legend of Anderson was accessible and familiar to all, and for a century and a half was deemed an authentic history, and even at the present day is accepted by some over-credulous and not well-informed Masons as a real narrative of the rise and progress of Masonry. Anderson, in his history of the origin of Masonry, mindful of the French proverb, to commencer par le commencement, begins by attributing to Adam a knowledge of geometry as the foundation of masonry and architecture, words which throughout his legend he uses as synonymous terms. These arts he taught to his sons, and Cain especially practiced them by building a city. Seth also was equally acquainted with them and taught them to his offspring. Hence the antediluvian world was well acquainted with masonry. Footnote. Oliver has readily accepted this theory of an antediluvian masonry and written several very learned and indeed interesting works on the subject, and erected many curious works until the time of Noah, who built the ark by the principles of geometry and the rules of masonry. Noah and his 3 sons, who were all masons, brought with them to the New World the traditions and arts of the antediluvians. Noah is therefore deemed the founder of masonry in the post-diluvian world, and hence Anderson called a mason a true Noahide or Noachite, a term used to the present day. The descendants of Noah exercised their skill in masonry in the attempted erection of the Tower of Babel, but were confounded in their speech and dispersed into various countries, whereby the knowledge of masonry was lost. Footnote. This part of the legend has been preserved in the American rituals, wherein the candidate is said to come from the lofty Tower of Babel, where language was confounded and masonry lost, and to be proceeding to the threshing floor of Ornu, the Jebusite, the Temple of Solomon, where language was restored and masonry found. It was, however, preserved in Shinar and Assyria, where Nimrod built many cities. In those parts afterward flourished many priests and mathematicians under the name of Chaldees and Magi, who preserved the science of geometry or masonry, and thence the science and the art were transmitted to later ages and distant climes. Footnote. By the science is meant geometry, and by the art, architecture, a distinction preserved in the Middle Ages, and the combination of them into geometrical masonry constitute the mystery of the Freemasons of that period. Mitzrayim, the second son of Ham, carried masonry into Egypt, where the overflowing of the banks of the Nile caused an improvement in geometry and consequently brought masonry much into request. Masonry was introduced into the land of Canaan by the descendants of the youngest son of Ham and into Europe, as he supposes, by the posterity of Japhet, although we know nothing of their works. The posterity of Shem also cultivated the art of masonry, and Abraham, the head of one branch of that family, having thus obtained his knowledge of geometry and the kindred sciences, communicated that knowledge to the Egyptians and transmitted it to his descendants, the Israelites. When, therefore, they made their exodus from Egypt, the Israelites were a whole kingdom of masons, and while in the wilderness were often assembled by their grand master Moses into a regular and general lodge. On taking possession of Canaan, the Israelites found the old inhabitants were versed in masonry, which, however, their conquerors greatly improved, for the splendor of the finest structures in Tyre and Sidon was greatly surpassed by the magnificence of the temple erected by King Solomon in Jerusalem. In the construction of this edifice, Solomon was assisted by the masons and carpenters of Hiram, king of Tyre, and especially by king of Tyre's namesake, Hiram or Huram, to whom, in a note, Anderson gives the name of Hiram Abiff, which name he has ever since retained among the craft. Footnote. In the first edition of this legend, Anderson makes no allusion to the death of Hiram Abiff during the building of the temple. He mentions it, however, in the second edition of the Constitutions, published 15 years afterward. This does not absolutely prove that he was at the time unacquainted with the tradition, but he may have thought it too esoteric for public record, for he says, in the very place where he should have referred to it, that he has left what must not and cannot be communicated in writing. Anderson gives in this legend the first detailed account of the Temple of Solomon that is to be found in any Masonic work. It is, however, only an appropriation of that contained in the books of Kings and Chronicles, with some statements for which he was probably indebted to his own invention. It has exerted a considerable influence upon other legends subsequently framed, and especially upon all the rituals, and indeed upon all the modern ideas of speculative Masons. Footnote. The peculiar details of the doctrine of Anderson have not been always respected. For instance, it is a very prevalent opinion among the craft at this day that there was a Master Mason's Lodge at the temple, over which Solomon presided as master, and the two Hirams as wardens, a theory which is not supported by Anderson, who says that King Solomon was Grand Master of the lodge at Jerusalem, King Hiram Grand Master of that at Tyre, and Hiram Abiff Master of Work. Constitutions, first edition, page 14.